been the weirdest thing. When we first moved here, our neighbors like, it never snows. We've been here 5 years. It snowed every single winter.
Y'all ready?
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of Raj Nation Innovations Discover Your Inner Awesome podcast. My name is Rajiv Nathan, aka The Raj Nation. I am your show's host, the founder of Raj Nation Innovation, as well as a hip-hop artist and a yoga instructor. Above all else, I am a storyteller. And I am joined by my co-host, Victoria Cohen. Victoria is the voice behind the blog almondsandasana.com. She is a fellow yogi and a community activist focused on helping you make lifestyle choices that positively impact you and the people you serve. This is Discover Your Inner Awesome, the only show where you get to eavesdrop on conversations with entrepreneurs, artists, and musicians about the stories, the journeys, the struggles, but most importantly, the questions. The questions that help creative thinkers like you and I better understand who we are, what we're doing, and how we can do it better. Is real talk with real people doing real big things to uncover the real side of success. Now, before we dive into today's conversation, I would like to extend an invitation if you are not a member already. Join our tribe by going to discoveryourinnerawesome.com. Enter your email address there, and you will never miss another episode of the show, getting a notification in your inbox every single Monday when we launch a new episode. You'll also get my stories, advice, and tips throughout the month on how you as a startup can make your pitch a performance. All right, let's dive in now to our conversation on today's episode of Discover Your Inner Awesome. Welcome everybody to the Discover Your Inner Awesome podcast. Today on the show, we have Josh Carter. Josh joins us as interim CEO of Patriot Bootcamp and former founder and CEO of Brightwork.io. Josh, thank you for being on the show today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
So our topic today is, how do you define your audience? I know you have a lot of experience with this, but tell our listeners why this is on your mind and why this is important to you.
Well, it's important because if you don't define your audience, you don't know where you're targeting, right? So if you build out this persona of what your ideal customer is, and if you don't go through that exercise, you're really just sort of throwing darts at a wall. And so it's really important to understand your customer, who it is, and how you're going to reach them.
So let's take it into your own personal experience then. You, again, we mentioned you're now interim CEO of Patriot Bootcamp, but prior to that, you founded and were CEO of Brightwork.io, which was a company, and correct me if I'm wrong here, if I get the description wrong, but essentially built around allowing developers to create to develop apps in a more lean and scalable way through an API platform. Is that right?
That's right. We took all of the things that you hate to do on your infrastructure side of things, like spinning up an EC2 bucket or an S3 or, doing email configuration. We did all that for the customer and provided an infrastructure platform similar to a SaaS-based model. And it enabled the developer to just simply tie in their front end using a RESTful endpoint and saved their development time by 70%.
Okay, great. So let's kind of take it back to the start then. Brightwork.io starts. You decide you're going to start this company. What are you doing in life at that point, and how does the idea even come about?
Sure. So I was an early employee at Twilio. We were about 60 people at the time, and around the same time I started, about a year after, I created a digital agency on the side called Plunk, and we were building apps for companies like Disney and Pabst Blue Ribbon and doing various different application solutions for different companies. And the consistent thing that kept happening was that we would have to build these back-end solutions over and over every single time the same way. So we knew there had to be a better way to solve this problem. And since we were a services company, we wanted to find a way to develop a product that would help sustain our business long term. So we actually created Brightwork out of the original digital marketing agency and spun that out as a separate business. We got a few alpha customers, and that put us through Techstars. Once we got into Techstars, we all quit our day jobs and went full-time with this business. So we went through Techstars with this business and opened our open beta while we were in the program.
Now, you've gone through the Techstars Accelerator, and for those listening who aren't familiar, Techstars is a startup accelerator that they, I guess they accelerate startups, for lack of better phrasing.
That's a great way to put it. Absolutely. And this is what I will tell people. If you have any military folks listening, it's very much like a boot camp. You have 3 months. The boot camp I went through, I'm a Navy vet, was 3 months as well. They break you down to build you up the way you're supposed to be operating. So there are very much parallels, and it's very intensive. You have mentor madness the first month. You have a lot of programming. So it's very intensive, but what you get out of it is a few things. When you get out a tremendous network you didn't have before, and you have the tools within your tool belt to figure out how to solve problems in a more efficient way.
So out of curiosity, to sort of break down a little bit more about what the sort of brief synopsis you just gave of sort of what was happening. So before that, you said you were in the Navy?
That's right.
And then how long had you been out and, working and sort of in the startup environment before you started that, your side hustle of that digital agency?
Yeah, it was probably almost 10 years. So
Okay.
I'd been in the telecom community for a long time. I'd been an engineer in the telecom space for a number of years. I started as I was crawling under houses and climbing up telephone poles, and then eventually led to working in cloud, which was Twilio. So I sort of jokingly say, if there was an evolutionary chart of telecommunications, I've literally worked every step of it.
That's so cool. That's crazy. But I think that's like an interesting thing to know, because sometimes it seems like, oh, these things just like happen overnight, and like they don't. Those skills take a long time to learn.
Well,
that's right.
And then I'm glad you brought that up. I'm glad you asked that, Victoria, because how does one go from climbing telephone poles to starting their own company?
Yeah.
It's weird. So I've always been a very creative person. I've always wanted to try to figure out how to create something. And so it started with, we were booking concerts in the Bay Area for friends of ours. And so that's how I started doing, like, quote unquote businesses. And the way it started was a friend of mine I went to high school with. He was having trouble getting gigs in the San Francisco Bay Area. It was just really hard. So we pretended that I was his booking agent. And so I would call venues and pretend like I was his booking agent and get him gigs that way. And eventually bands caught on that I was doing this. And so other bands would approach me, hey, can you do this for me as well? And eventually it led to sort of like this thing that we did. The crescendo to that was we created a festival, and I lost a tremendous amount of money. So my wife was like, we can't do this anymore. You have to find something else to do. So I moved into doing internet radio. So I did internet radio for 4 or 5 years, and the conversation around it was where people thought the music industry was going to head. And so we had people like George Clinton, we had Imagine Dragons, Margaret Cho, Henry Rollins on the show weekly, just talking about where people thought the music industry was heading. And so the Plunk, the digital agency, the specific objective of that was to bridge the gap between the music industry and technology. Because I was going to all these talks and musicians were just feeling jaded that the music industry and the tech industry weren't playing nice. Apple had just bought Beats for $3 billion. And if you ask musicians, they didn't benefit from that, even though it was their product being sold. And so musicians still felt abandoned by technology. So when we did Plunk, we built it to solve that problem. So we built a site for Taco Bell called feedthebeat.com, and it was a program it was a program that Taco Bell built to help up and coming bands. Well, we built that platform for Taco Bell. And so everything that I've done on the side has led to the next thing, right? So Brightwork was because we kept building these solutions and we needed to figure out a way to build these solutions faster. The radio thing was because I lost so much money booking shows. So there's a deliberate step to everything I've done.
Yeah,
I like that, and it kind of helps paint the picture a little bit more clear. But I'm curious to know now, like, so you go from booking to internet radio to Plunk.
Was this all on the side while you were climbing these telephone poles? Or moving through that career, at least?
Yeah, a lot of times it was. And because, I wasn't I have a family. I'm a father of 3 kids. So, the realistic part of growing a business is that you still have to make money somewhere. So, I would have a day job, and I was doing very well. I would still get promotions in the jobs that I was in, and still able to sort of build out these businesses on the side as well.
So from that transition from Plunk and spinning out Brightwork, Brightwork takes you away from music. Was that intentional, and how did you feel about that? Because it seems like music is a pretty big passion of yours.
Yeah, it did take me away from it, but it's such an interesting intersect between technology and every other industry that's out there. So I jokingly say that every company out there is a tech company, because if they don't, they just don't figure out how to grow and scale. And so, even though we were moving away from being in the music industry per se, we were still touching that in the customers that we were dealing with. So I think this is a great transition to talk about how you find your ideal customer, because for Brightwork, it was a struggle for us. We knew the pain point we were solving and who the customer could be, but we identified way too many use cases. So we tried to chase so many down. So we knew that digital marketing agencies needed this, but we knew that developers would benefit from this as well. So we were a team of 2 chasing our tail in 3 different directions.
Okay, so take us through then the early days of Brightwork. And I will say, by the way, I do like that you've pointed out here that each thing was a deliberate step, or that each past experience helped shape the next experience, because that's something that I think a lot of founders ignore, where they think if it's not directly related to the startup they're doing now, it doesn't count. But that's really important in being able to tell your story, especially like to an investor when they want to know who are you as a person. Like, that's interesting stuff to be able to say, like, I was an internet radio host within the music industry, because it shows, where you think, and it shows your train of thought and how you bring that mindset to Brightwork.
Yeah, and how you discovered certain problems that needed to be solved.
Yeah, I got like the history of problem solving almost in your own life.
Yeah, and I think the most successful companies out there are because a founder or somebody was pained by something and they wanted to solve that problem, right? So if you think about Uber, they were just sick of the cumbersome taxi industry. If you think about Twilio, Jeff Lawson was sick and tired of paying hundreds of thousands for these monolithic boxes that couldn't do anything, right? So if you think about some of the companies that are big today, you think about these pains that they were dealing with, and they just wanted to solve that pain point and lower the friction for everybody. And so that was what we were attempting to do with Brightwork, was lower the friction so that when people wanted to build these applications, they could do so in a more efficient manner.
So we get into the Brightwork days now. You talked about you and your co-founder chasing your tails.
Yeah.
You have the digital marketing audience, and you have was it the just independent app developer audience?
That's right. Yeah,
Okay.
Just developers that maybe they had a few clients and they wanted to build an app for their clients, and this would help ease their burden.
Okay. So before we get into the market separation, let's talk about what was the business model for Brightwork. How were you planning to make money? And in your early days, you're looking at it, every company throws out their projections that are pretty, more art than they are science.
Yeah.
What were your early projections, and then what was the business model to ideally achieve those?
Yeah, I think we didn't really have a really good idea what our projections would be, and it's funny looking back now. It's sort of comedy that we put some sort of projection in our deck for investors. Like, we were going to make 50,000 the first quarter and then 100,000 the next quarter. We were stupid. There's no way we're going to do that, because we haven't even mapped out our monetization yet. So we were a SaaS-based model. So you would pay for the amount of API calls you would make per month. So if you think of the way an application works, if you have an API for some sort of, say, SMS for Twilio, right? Every time you make a call to that API, we would be able to charge you for that transaction. So same thing with MailChimp or Mandrill or whatever mail service you use. Every time you made an API request back to our platform, we can register that and sort of use that as the benchmark for how much we were going to charge you. The challenge there, though, became mapping all the different services we were providing in the back end, and enabling us to charge efficiently. And so that was the biggest challenge for us. We made our billing model way too complicated for our own good.
Well, first off, on the projections front, it's funny how you mentioned 50,000 Q1, 100,000 Q2. One of the companies that I'm working with right now, I was talking to them the other day, and 2018 projection was like 2 million in revenue. And I'm like, okay, we're almost in March. I guess by the time this episode comes out, it is March, right? And I'm like, okay, so we're at the end of quarter one here, or we're hitting the end of quarter one here. And you said $2 million and 53 customers. And right now you have 4, maybe 5 customers. How do you plan to get the next 49 and reach that $2 million by the end of this year? And it's kind of like oh crap, we don't have a sales strategy moment, right? And that's that's how you get away from the art and more into the science and really just the straight math of things and knowing what you need to focus your time on. So when you look at that breakdown in your own company or breakout rather in your own company of 50,000 and then 100,000, and you said there was complications in the billing, did you have in your mind a real path to getting there, or was it more hey, we'll build this thing, people will want it, and money will happen?
Yeah, so that was so 5 years ago. I would say that's absolutely the way to go, right? You build some sort of platform, you get a critical mass of people, and then at some point you figure out how to monetize that. Investors don't want to see that anymore, especially from first-time founders. I was even told from investors, good friends of mine who ran great large firms in the San Francisco Bay Area. This was about 2 years ago. Look, if you had 5 customers paying you 1 month, and you had 7 customers paying you the next month, and another 10 paying you the next month, I could scrape together a $3 million angel round. They just want to see that you can iterate on the success of having somebody pay you. Look, a business is a hypothesis until someone gives you money for it. That's the day it becomes a business. So investors don't want to invest in a hypothesis. They want to invest in businesses that show some sort of substantial growth. And so if you can, this is what I wish we would have done in the first day one. I wish we would have turned on monetization before we even gave it to one person, because then we can measure the value they're getting out of it. Now, we did get one customer to pay us, and they built an app for Taylor Swift for the Super Bowl, which was amazing. They built the app in 2 days. They had Taylor Swift's team approve it. We processed 250,000 API calls in a 30-day period, and they absolutely loved it. But again, it went back to, we could either focus on developers or we can focus on business customers. We can't focus on both. And so that was our challenge, and ultimately led to our demise, because what ended up happening is we ran out of cash before we could figure that problem out. And so that's what founders really have to be careful of, is if you don't identify a customer, one type of customer persona, and you're not out there beating the drum to get them to pay for you, then you're going to run out of runway very quickly. And maybe you don't. Maybe you have a great golden parachute, or you have rich parents that can keep it going. You're the Taylor Swift of startups, and that's awesome. But for the 99% that don't, you need to figure out from day one how to get somebody to pay for your services, so that you can measurably show that the next person will pay, and how you show that is super important.
So why was it that you guys couldn't decide who your audience was, sort of between these two categories of people that you felt like you were trying to provide services for? What was the holdup? Was it just that you couldn't pick one, or was it not a clear distinction of who was going to be the more profitable audience to go after? Why was that difficult?
I think it was just a case of us being too early. I think we went through Techstars way too early. If I had to do over again, I would have waited until we had a few paying customers, and we did figure that out. I think what our issue was is we had a business customer that came to us and said, I would love to use this for our business, but we were focused on developers at the time. So we did have a single focus, but what distracted us was having a business customer say, I find this profoundly valuable. I would love to use this for our business. How can we figure this out? So it distracted us in a way, and then led us down this path of okay, well, that makes sense. Let's go find another business customer, because we found one already, And then we should also kind of focus on the developers on the right side over here, because we know that the developers will find it valuable. Again, it was a distraction by accident for us.
Yeah, that's so interesting, because it probably at the beginning when someone came along that was not your initial target audience but saw an application for your services, it was probably really exciting. Like, oh wow, there's this whole other realm that we didn't even realize we could tap into, and that's kind of what I imagine it would be like. But so interesting that maybe could actually, even though it might present itself as like a really great building opportunity, that it may actually be the thing that hurts you.
Yeah, very true. And what I tell founders now is that, when you look back at Amazon, Jeff Bezos said we're going to be the biggest bookstore in the world. He didn't say we're going to be the biggest bookstore, and we're going to drop stuff on people's houses with drones, and we're going to create virtual servers, and no, he said I'm going to be the biggest bookstore in the world. And when he moved on to the next thing.
Right.
And so I think that's what founders need to look at, is how can they solve a really simple problem, get it in the hands of someone that will pay for it, and then keep iterating on that success.
Yeah, it's smart, progressive growth, not trying to do it all at once. And my own experience with this, my last company, Idea Lemon, our downfall, and there were a couple of reasons for the downfall, but I'd say the biggest reason was that we were in like audience paralysis mode. And Victoria, earlier you were like, how, like what is it that made you not be able to choose? And Josh, you let me know if this is your mindset as well, but for us at the time, so we had developed this online course. It took us a while to figure out like what the product was going to be though, and what we were going to be selling. And in that time, we had built up this audience of several different types of people. If you were to boil it down to like a top three though, the audience we had was people who were, and the online course was for personal branding, okay?
Yep.
The audience we had developed, if you pared it down, it was three different audiences. It was people who wanted a new job because they hated their current job, people who liked their job but wanted to move up in their company, and entrepreneurs. And what we did was we created this personal branding course, but we couldn't answer personal branding for whom.
Right.
And when we did answer it, it was for job changers, move up in your current company, and entrepreneurs. The problem is that is three, even if like the strategies are the same, that's three
right.
very distinct messages and three very different sales strategies that have to be implemented. But we tried to put it all into one. And then if you looked at like our sales page, like how we did the sales we did, I don't know. Like I think we just got by on the fact that we had good personalities and people wanted to like be involved with what we were doing. But it was like, we'd show like, hey, this person we had like these like beta customers who went through it, and we'd be like, this person had success. He got featured on this podcast, which has a reach of this, and got a new job with a $20,000 salary increase. And then like beneath that, we'd be like, and this person got accepted into MIT's Accelerator for her startup idea. And I'm like, looking back, it's like, what random person would read this and be like, oh, this is for me because it's for everyone, which it's never the case, right?
Yeah. The red flag for me should have been when we were trying to create two different sites for two different audiences. Looking back, if you're trying to create a different website for a different audience, right, then that's a red flag. You're trying to boil the ocean here, and you're not going after one target audience. And so that should have been a red flag for us. Looking back now, like Monday morning quarterbacking this thing, like we should not have created two different sites for two different customer segments.
And I'm glad you point that out, because some companies will be like, well, we're just going to test and see which one does better. But man, just test one first. And if that doesn't work, then test the other one. Because the worst thing that happens is you get a little bit of success in both, because then it just confuses what you do next.
Absolutely. We had a great mentor who was a coworker of mine. His name's John Sheehan, ran RunScope, which is an API testing tool. And he gave us a great advice. He said, look, there will always be 1,000 customers to piss off. Don't worry. You could cycle through the next 1,000, piss those people off, because there'd be another 1,000 right behind them. So don't worry about it. Just get your product out, find things that work. When they released their product, they didn't have API testing as one of their things on their roadmap. But when they released their product, more customers were coming back to them and saying, hey, I would love to be able to test my API. And at some point, it became like the majority of what was bringing in revenue. So when I say focus on customers, that's why it's so important, because the customers will drive what they find valuable out of your platform and will ultimately get some sort of value out of it. Now they got acquired by CA Technologies, and they're doing very well.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I'm just thinking, I had a similar conversation to this when I started a blog a little less than a year ago. And when I started it, I was talking to a couple of friends of mine, and sort of like, okay, well, on Mondays I'm going to post about this, and Tuesdays I'm going to talk about this, and like all these different things that I like wanted to include in my blog. And one friend was like, you know what? I think like scale it down to like just like one or two of those things to start with, and like really focus on those. And then over time, as you build up an audience that's really interested in that, like then maybe you can start to expand a little bit. But if you start like just so broad, it's going to be a lot harder to capture any sort of like engaged audience than if you start with something like a bit more niche, and then eventually build from there. So just interesting kind of revisiting this conversation.
Yeah, no, it's one of those things where we had an early advisor that said, pick a lane and stick to it, right? So when we created the platform, we were asked, well, who is this for? And we said developers. Well, that's a stupid answer, because there's all kinds of developers, right? There's front end, there's back end, there's JavaScript. And we said, well, okay, fine, web developers. And they said, well, okay, again, that's stupid, because you have React, you have all these other different web platforms. And so we said, okay, fine, web JavaScript developers, that's who we're catering. And so we picked a lane. And then afterwards, we started to move into iOS and Android doing SDKs. And so it's really important to just sort of, quote unquote, pick your lane and stay in it until you've found success and you can move out.
Mm-hmm. And it's amazing too how much that'll help all the other like little parts. Like it helps writing your copy on your website so much if you know exactly, like you said, web Java developers. Like you can write different copy for them than you would for like Ruby developers.
That's right. Yep. Yeah, and that's what helped us in the early stages of our open beta. We released our open beta, got great press. We were number 3 on Product Hunt for the day. Got a great feature on TechCrunch. I mean, we crushed it on our opening day, and then I think we got like 500 or so signups in the first hour. And then after that, it just sort of waned, and we started going after developers and business customers, and that's ultimately where the wheels started coming off the bus.
Yeah, so you mentioned like you had that 2 websites moment. For my previous company, Idea Lemon, our moment was on I think it was a Thursday night, on a Thursday night. We sponsored a table at this conference that was for people it was a career fair conference.
Yeah. And
then on Friday, we sponsored a table at an artists and musicians and entrepreneurs conference. And then we came back on Monday to the office, and we were like, what the hell are we doing? Like that was awful. Like we were on back-to-back days at 2 completely different types of conferences, and saying our company was 2 completely different things.
Yeah.
And we acted like it was okay in the moment, but what the hell are we doing? So for your 2 websites moment, is that a looking back, or at the time were you like, something's wrong here? And if it wasn't the 2 websites, was there another point when you said something's wrong here?
I mean, for us, the something wrong here was we ran out of cash. But yeah, I mean, I think looking back, we kept charging forward, and we had some really good mentors that were questioning our motives. But I think we were seeing just this flicker of smoke, right? We had a lot of developers that signed up the first day. We had a business customer that approached us because they thought the thing was valuable. So we saw little glimmers of that there was something there. But the problem was it hampered our ability to raise more funds. And so again, we were out there fundraising. We were trying to go get more customers. We were trying to do content marketing. We were doing blogs. We were going out to CES, and we were going out to Dreamforce. We were doing too much. And as a team of 2, it was just really hard to do one thing well. And so at the end of the day, the other thing was, when we ran out of cash, my CTO had to go get a job. We both had families, so he had to go find a job. And so that really scuttled our progress as well. I thankfully had a little bit of savings that I can kind of fall back on. But, I spent 3 or 4 months trying to find somebody to replace him at and it just wasn't successful. We just couldn't. And we had lost momentum, so it made no sense to keep going with the business at that point.
In that process, then you pull the plug on this company. Now, it was a ran out of cash moment, but I'm sure it wasn't bank account hit zero and then you said we don't have a company anymore. There was, my guess, correct me if I'm wrong, my guess was there was a ramping down point where you're like, okay, this isn't working. We are running out of cash. Do you remember at which point you said it's time to move on? And can you talk us through what went into that decision, both from a business standpoint, but even more so an emotional standpoint?
Yeah, so that's great that you bring that up, because I think a lot of folks don't really talk about the dark side of startups where, it takes a mental toll when you fail. What happens when you fail is that the calls stop coming in, the texts stop coming in, the emails stop flowing in. You're basically on this island. So for me, it was a long path. I fell into deep depression. It was hard for me because as a military vet, I don't want to let anybody down. I mean, that's just the way I'm built. And I'm also taking friends and family money. So now I have to look these friends and family in the eye and say they're never going to get their money back. So I took that hard. I took that really hard. So there was three months where I literally could not get out of bed. And the thing that really got me out of it, and the thing that I finally accepted what was happening, was the fact that I just wasn't spending much time with my family. I wasn't finding a path to find my happy again, and I wasn't accepting of the fact that this was over. So when I finally came to that realization, it was easy to move on. I mean, it still hurts. Don't get me wrong. I did a talk at Phoenix Startup Week, and my talk was surviving startup failure. It was standing room only, and I heard a bunch of people just tell their stories of failure and how it still hurts, and it does. You don't get over that, because in my mind, I felt like there may still be a play where there's a back end as a service that succeeds really well, and I really thought Brightwork could have been that. So I think for me, it was just coming to the realization that I wasn't going to be able to find somebody to replace my CTO. I wasn't going to be able to do it myself. I just didn't have the coding chops to do it. And at some point, I needed to move on for the sake of my sanity, for the sake of my family, for the sake of my friends, for the sake of my happiness. And so I go out and I do these talks for surviving startup failure. We do it at Patriot Bootcamp as well. And I think the thing that really kicked me out of my funk was I went to the Patriot Bootcamp in Denver as a mentor. I hadn't joined the company yet. And we did this with veterans that had seen combat action in Afghanistan or Iraq, and had sat in that room with me and told me their stories of failure, and had told me that they felt like killing themselves because of that failure. Now that hit me like a ton of bricks, because I don't know when startup failure eclipsed PTSD as a threat to our veterans. That instantly woke me up, and I made it my mission to make sure that startup failure was part of the discussion for mental health. And what I absolutely love is Techstars, Brad Feld, is now starting to talk about how they can add mental health as part of the conversation when companies go through Techstars, and adding that as a possible service, like allowing founders to go talk to a counselor about the problems they're faced with. Because as a founder, as a CEO, as someone who goes through this, you really go through it alone. I mean, your friends and family go through it as well, but you really feel as though you're on this island. And so it's a tough conversation to have, but very much an important one. So I'm glad you brought it up.
It's funny you mentioned that, because not funny, I should say, but Victoria and I smiled at each other because it reminded us both at the same time. We did an episode last season with Eric Severinghouse, who is on the I think Chief Strategy Officer at Spring CM here in Chicago, and that episode was titled "How Do You Navigate the Abyss?" And it was very much around the idea of entrepreneur loneliness, and how I think he even also said it's like you're on this island and you have no one to talk to. And
just like the lack of transparency about when things are, like how as a startup, and as the CEO of a startup or the founder, how it's very hard to necessarily be transparent when you're going through a really rough period. Like you don't want to necessarily put it out there that like you're not doing so well, because you don't want, you don't want that floating around. But at the same time, that there's this like sort of internal struggle.
Oh yeah, and people would ask me all the time. People that didn't see me in a while be like, "Hey, Josh, how you doing?" And my response was the same every time. Oh, living the dream, living the dream,
Yeah,
man. This is
right.
amazing. And inside, I knew my heart was getting ripped out because this baby, this thing that I was so passionate about, was dying, and I couldn't bring it back to life for anything.
Mm-hmm. One thing that, as you mentioned, as you were able to kind of crawl out of that it reminded me of as well is a couple years ago we did an episode with Amber Ardolino, who's part of the Hamilton Chicago cast. She actually just had her last show. But one of the things that came out of that episode was the fact that, performers and entrepreneurs are very similar.
Mm-hmm.
They are putting their all into what they do. Now, the main difference is someone like her, who's part of the Hamilton cast, she does a show every single night. Now, you go to work every day for your startup, but it's not necessarily like a public-facing thing every single day. And she may have a show where she feels she didn't do so hot, or she didn't do her best, she didn't do great. She may have screwed up, one step in the millions of steps she has to remember for that song, for the song and dance sequences. And as much as she takes it to heart, she realizes at the same time it's something it's not her. Like, she put her all into it. It's not her. It's something she created, and she can create more. She has to be able to let go of it and come back the next day and do it again. Yep. And I think it's that same mindset here. It's just that you don't think of it as an everyday create and let go, create and let go. It's like, in your case, what was it, a year and a half that you were running this company, and then it's like that was performance number one, and then you obviously you feel really bad, but when you crawl out of it is when you realize, hey, that was not my identity, that was not me. I was part of that thing, I created that thing, but I created it. It's not who Josh is at the end of the day.
Yeah, and I'm very proud of what we were able to accomplish in such a short amount of time. But there are things that I wish we could have tried to figure out, because there were things in our roadmap that we thought were going to be profoundly valuable. We just never were given a chance to get to that point. And I think that's what hurts the most, because I think there's a path here where there's a back end as a service that's going to win. I think the anxiety that was created in our particular industry was Parse was bought by Facebook and then was shut down. And so we had to answer that. Even though we weren't part of that, we still had to answer that in investor meetings or customer meetings. Are you guys going to be shut down too if you guys get acquired? Firebase got acquired by Google when originally they were a database as a service, and they pivoted as a backend as a service. And so there was a lot of like, well, how are you going to beat Google? And so we had to answer that question. And so there was a lot of anxiety around backend as a service, and there just being a temporary component to it. And the other part of it is the scale. At some point, people were going to move off of our platform because it just wasn't going to be scalable enough. So we had answered those questions. So, you have to have a defensible position in your business or it's going to fail. And there's a lot of different reasons a business fails, but, founders account for 80% of the failures in startups. And the reason is for what I've outlined here in this program is we didn't pick a lane. We focused on too many things. We didn't have a defensible position that we could easily define. And we had a co-founder that left when we ran out of cash. So there were a lot of things that I could go back and post-mortem what happened. But at the end of the day, if we would have been very deliberate about our movements and tried to move slower, we may still be around.
So you talked about getting involved in Patriot Bootcamp, first going there as a mentor. Obviously, you have your military veteran experience with the Navy. You're now the interim CEO. Can you talk us through real quick how you got into that position and what you're focused on?
Yeah, so again, when I went to Denver, the Denver Patriot Bootcamp, their leader, Charlotte Creech, was in the midst of having some attrition herself within her own organization. So she approached me about helping her lead the organization. She knew that Brightwork was winding down, and so the timing just fit. And so after February 1st, she transitioned into a new role. And so I was just brought in as the new CEO. And so, so that's sort of the backstory behind it. I had been going to different Patriot Bootcamps, first as an attendee and then coming back as a mentor/speaker. But it's definitely a community I'm very passionate about. We focus on military veterans and spouses and really focus on tech startups. So we've had 750 companies come through the program. We've done 12 of these. They've collectively raised over 70 million in funding and created over 1,300 jobs in the market. So we're moving the needle slowly but surely, and just trying to create more programming to add value to these founders.
Something you mentioned there that I think it's kind of a side note, but I think it's important for people to understand, especially entrepreneurs who are earlier in the game, is you first went to this thing as an attendee, then a mentor, then a speaker. Now you're CEO. There's a gradual, and it kind of comes back to the original point, right? There's a gradual buildup there. It's progressive. And I think there are a lot of people who are wondering why they are not speaking at the conferences today for how great their company is. It takes time, and you have to go on your journey of like attendee to being at the top of this thing, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it takes time. I mean, when I was at Twilio, they were already 4 years into it, and they had 65,000 developers on their platform. And I remember we had a party when we first hit 3 million in like revenue. And looking back, it's funny. I talked to earlier employees that just laugh about that, because now they're 1,200 employees. They have over 2 million people on their platform, and they're making an ungodly amount of money, and they've gone IPO, right? So, it just takes time. They've been doing this for 10 years now, but it was a very slow progress. Like, how are you going to get somebody that knows that there's a phone system out there to realize that you can build a phone system with 4 lines of code? When I realized that, after going through the 10 years or so that I was in telecom and realizing that I can make a phone ring with 4 lines of code, that was just, my mind was blown, and I was sold. And so I think that really was the aha moment for me. But it takes time. It takes time for every entrepreneur.
And it was on that day that you decided to throw away your like knee pads with little spikes on the side that help you scale a wooden telephone pole.
Yeah. No more would I crawl under a house to run residential phone line.
But you know how. That's cool.
I do know how.
It's one of those like random like manliness traits.
Skills.
Like
That's right. Yeah. If there's any grandmothers listening, I can help you with your phone line.
Now there's a market. All right. So where can our listeners learn more about you and get in touch?
Yeah, so Patriot Bootcamp is probably the easiest place. It's patriotbootcamp.org. I'm on Twitter. It's Joshua J. Carter _. But people are free to email me. I'm carter@patriotbootcamp.org. Always happy to talk about my journey, and hopefully that my mistakes and missteps can somehow lead to value that I bring to founders.
So to wrap up, we will go one by one. Based on today's conversation, we'll go one by one and give our respective answers to the topic question for today. The topic question for today was, how do you define your audience? We'll start with Victoria, then we'll go to me. Josh will close with you. So Victoria,
Sure.
How do you define your audience?
Well, I think based on what we talked about today, being really clear and sort of sticking to one more like niche market or audience is really important in starting out. And I think also this sort of coming back to this idea of like taking your time, right? So Josh, you mentioned a few times that like, if you had taken a little bit more time in the process of like really sorting it out before you went full steam ahead in multiple directions, that you might have been able to better define that audience early on, and sort of, Raj, to your point, and instead of like trying with multiple audiences at once, instead trying one out, really testing that method, making sure that audience is the right audience, or maybe that they're not, and then moving on from there. So yeah, I think it's a bit of taking your time and then just being really clear on who it is.
My answer, how do you define your audience? Well, as one of my mentors told me, you can't be a mile wide and an inch deep. So, and I love that advice.
That's great.
Start narrow. You can always add more later as you grow, but you cannot start. It's like emotionally impossible to have several audiences and decide to start shaving off from there. And then tactically, the companies I work with, what I take them through is an exercise where we actually create I call it just an audience funnel. So if you picture a funnel on a screen or on a board, it's got layers to it, and this helps define who their audience is down to specific person and like archetype. So the top layer of the funnel is these people. The second layer is have this problem. The next layer down is which makes them feel this way. the last layer is at this time. And then the output of the funnel is therefore they want to feel blank. And what you've created with that, these people, this problem, this feeling, this time, is a specific type of person you're going after with a specific emotional need associated to the problem that exists. And that'll help you really move forward in a targeted way.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. And I'll simplify it. If you are creating a platform or product or service that you have been pained with, then you are the target. Find other yous, right? So, we were a digital marketing agency that were building out platforms that we just needed to be more efficient, right? So we should have found other digital marketing agencies who we knew were pained with this and focus on those folks.
Josh, one last question for you.
Yeah.
You mentioned a couple times, you're like, I do think there's a market out there for this back-end as a service thing. Do you think is there another go in you outside of Patriot? Is there another go in you as a founder?
Yeah, I'm 42 years old. I have teenage kids. I don't know if I have the stamina. It's really difficult, and that's the key. You have to have stamina. You have to be able to sustain this pace that you go. And look, the thing that I knew I was in trouble was when my 6-year-old son drew a picture of the family, and in my picture I had my laptop. That, for me, that was the aha moment. I need to scale back my workaholic type of ways. So I would absolutely love to do another startup. It is the most amazing, challenging, frustrating, fun process to go through. But at some point, you have to think about your work-life balance. So yes, I think there's something in me that wants to do something else. But at the end of the day, I put my family through all of this just like I did. So I'd have to sit down and make sure that my family was okay as well.
Josh Carter, thank you for joining us on the show.
Hey, thanks for having me, guys.
That wrapped up our conversation. Did you, the listener, enjoy this episode? If so, the best compliment you can give us is a rating and review on iTunes. Ratings and reviews help more people find the show, therefore more people get to discover their inner awesome. While you're leaving that review, go ahead and subscribe to the show on whatever platform it is you listen, whether that is iTunes, Google Play, SoundCloud, Stitcher, or the various other podcasting platforms in which you can find the show. For full show notes, references, and resources from this episode, you can grab it all at discoveryourinnerawesome.com. Also, check out our 100-plus episode archive while you're there. Whole lot of awesome for you to dig into. That'll do it for this one. Thank you again to our guests for joining. For Victoria Cohen, I am Raj Nation. You have been listening to the Discover Your Inner Awesome podcast. We will see you next time, but in the meantime, take care and be awesome today.
Wake up!